there fellow guitarists, Josh Rogers here. Welcome to today's tutorial, which is going to cover a few exercises for the left hand, specifically ascending slurs or legatos, or more commonly known as hammer-ons. Let's get straight into it. I'm going to be using all four fingers, and there's two principles that I'm going to be passing on to you today. The first one involves taking off fingers after you've done the hammer-on. So that's one, and the other one is leaving them on after you've done the hammer-on. So I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail about what that means, and I'll show you the first exercise at the same time. The idea here is to have your thumb in a good position at the back. Usually I have my thumb between these two fingers, like this. That helps to distribute the pressure evenly across the hand. For you it may be slightly different. You may prefer your thumb a little bit more over that way or over this way. It's really up to you. But I do tend to have it at the same spot on the neck, and that's usually just below the middle of the neck. So we've got the middle of the neck here. My thumb is usually about there, but it does depend on yourself, the feel of your guitar. There's a lot of variations that can come into it, but for general rule it's about there. What I'm going to be doing is using two fingers at any given time. So I'm going to start off at the first fret, but you can start anywhere, but I'm going to use the first fret, and I'm going to be hammering on from 1 to 2 like this. One of the main things to remember is it's not actually about the distance that your finger travels to make a good sounding hammer on. It's more about the speed with which it hits the string, or at which it hits the string. So you'll see that I don't really need to approach from a high distance. The general rule is that you should try to keep your fingers less than 1 centimeter or 10 millimeters or about half an inch from the strings. So there, what I'm doing is I'm leaving this finger on, and I'm filling up this finger with weight or with energy or gravity, or however you want to think about it. I'm filling it up for that fleeting instant, and then I release. Now the next one, I'm going to use these two fingers, 2 and 3, and I'm going to leave this finger on. Then I'm doing 3 and 4, and I'm going to leave both of these fingers on. Then 2 and 4, then 1 and 4, and then 1 and 3. Now the reason I'm leaving this finger on with the first principle is that in classical guitar playing, and also for fingerstyle guitar playing, we usually as a guitar player have to hold notes while our other fingers are doing something else. For the most part it's holding a bass note while we're doing something else, maybe. That note has to sustain. Usually in electric guitar playing it's more about and then solos, and for the most part they just involve one note. So the holding of these fingers down helps you to develop strength and independence while your other fingers are moving. The other way to do it is to release your fingers after they've finished. So we've got the same starting, but this time I'm going to let this finger off. These two fingers, I try to keep control of them, so I don't want them flying all out over the place. I keep them positioned just above the string. 2 and 4, 1 and 4, 1 and 3. So two principles. One, keep all your fingers on. Second principle, release your fingers after they're finished. One thing to note, you should have an awareness of the fingers that you're not using. For example, if we take 2 and 3, you should know what these two fingers are doing. This finger here will always suffer some sympathetic movement, which means it's going to move along with your third finger. There's not much that can be done about that, but the idea is just to know what these two are doing and make sure they're not, flailing away too far away from the strings. The reason for that is you want to try to keep your fingers close to the strings. That does two things. It helps with accuracy and it helps with speed, because the distance traveled is not as far, and it's much easier to hit something from a near distance than it is to hit something from a far distance. you can practice that in many different variations. You can move down the strings. Another thing you can do is just practice like traveling down vertically like this. The next one. And you can practice that anywhere. You can also do things like this, which is travelling laterally across the fretboard. The choice is yours. There's so many different variations that you can do, and in some ways it's quite a lot of fun just to experiment with, like some cool things that you might do that and then something like that. There's a huge number of possibilities, and it's all up to you. If you want to stretch your fingers out, you can do that type of thing. So many variations, but I'll cover some more in another tutorial. The next thing to consider is the position of your elbow or your forearm, or both actually. When I'm playing, I tend to draw back from the elbow, so this kind of thing here. And that keeps the general position of the hand the same. Like the angle of my wrist, it's not sort of going bent and then straightening out. The general angle stays fairly similar. Try to keep your wrist quite flat. In principle, that sounds great, but in practice, it's virtually impossible to keep it absolutely straight. But that's one of the things that we're trying to do. And what that does is basically it relieves any excess tension, or removes any excess tension from your tendons that are running across here. A lot of guitarists suffer at one time or another from like carpal tunnel syndrome or repetitive stress injury. Try to play as naturally as possible. One of the ways you can do that is by trying to keep this wrist flat. A little exercise you can do, you can keep your wrist flat and just wiggle your fingers like that, and you'll find that that's easy. There's sort of no discomfort, doesn't hurt or anything. But as you start bending your wrist, you'll find that it becomes harder and harder and harder to move your fingers easily, and it can also almost start to hurt in here. That's why, as a guitar player, you want to try to keep your wrist nice and flat, and that can be achieved by moving like that rather than doing something like this. There will always be a certain amount of this, but what we're trying to do is just minimize that. Another exercise you can do is just a complete legato run, ascending, like that. You can do that. What you're trying to do too is also aim for a consistent volume. Usually for us it's always the pinky, this fourth finger, that tends to have not much strength. So you might identify that these two fingers are really strong, and for probably 99% of us it's the case. These two are really strong and these two are quite weak when they're working together. Particularly 3 and 4. 2 and 4 is usually okay. 1 and 4, but it's 3 and 4. It's just the way our hand is constructed. These two fingers seem to be connected somehow. I don't understand the physiology, but anyone that plays guitar knows that coordinating things between these two fingers alone is quite a challenge. So you might just want to concentrate on 3 and 4 only. Also make sure as you're travelling down the strings that you try to avoid this angling, which is a common thing. Usually when we get to the first few strings we want to go like that. And the problem with that is it upsets what you have set up here. So your fingers get used to this, and then suddenly you get here and your little finger's got to reach out further. Actually, it could miss, you know, like this. But if you keep it like that, the angles tend to stay the same for your fingers and the distances remain the same. Also, you can stretch further. As soon as you start bringing in this twist and pushing your forearm out this way, your ability to stretch has been reduced. It does feel more comfortable, I admit it. Even after 20 or 30 years of playing, this feels a lot more comfortable to me, even though I've been playing classical guitar since I started playing. When I'm playing electric guitar, I will go into this, you know, especially if I'm doing some type of solo and it doesn't involve like a big stretch. I will do this and I will angle my hand that way. But in classical guitar playing, usually there's going to be some type of chord and it's going to be right there, and if you've gone like that, you might have a real hard time getting there. So for the most part, when you're practicing this, try to keep that angle. Try to avoid this thing here. Thank you, fellow guitarists. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial for the left hand, ascending legatos. The next tutorial for left hand is going to be the opposite, which is pull-offs or descending legatos. Until that time, let your fingers fly.